Goober Gang, what's going on? This is Captain Dan with Goober Time Guide Service. We just got a package in the mail. This is from Nets and More. We get asked all the time about gill nets. What are they all about? How do I use them? How do I set them up? What are the regulations? We're gonna cover all that in a video for you here today. We're getting ready to go on a guide trip tomorrow, so I'm gonna take a couple minutes tonight and get my gill net set up, ready to go. Brand new, fresh net. These are a tool. They do get beat up over time. They get caught on snags and whatnot. So every now and then you got to replace them, and it's time for me to make a change here. So we've got two nets that just came in the mail. We've got a 100-footer and a 50-footer. These are the two sizes that I recommend. A couple decisions you need to make right off the bat. First of all, are you even allowed to use a gill net? In Virginia, in the tidal waters, we're allowed to use that. I run guide trips on the James River where we are allowed to use gill nets. Now, not all the parts of the James River. I can't use the gill net up above the city of Richmond. I can use it from the city of Richmond and down, which is the tidal section, directly connects to Chesapeake Bay. There's a couple other rivers in Virginia that do the same thing, namely the Potomac, Rappahannock, things like that. So, got to watch out for that. Check in your state, make sure you know your regulations. A lot of places you're not allowed to use this fantastic tool, so definitely look into it first. Even in Virginia, we have regulations on what size mesh we're allowed to use, so we only catch certain types of bait. As an angler, it's your responsibility to know those rules, so look them up, talk to your wildlife resource agents, and just figure it out. It's not that big of a deal. Now, in the state of Virginia, you have to buy a gill net license and able to use one of these tools to catch bait. It's a little confusing on the website. I'll pop up the thing you're looking for right here on the DWR website. You have to buy a 300-foot saltwater gill net license, and as a recreational angler that only covers you for a 100-foot net, and it's not spelled out super clear in there. Depending on when you're watching this video, those rules may or may not have changed, so definitely look into those regulations and be careful, be on the safe side. Once you determine you are allowed to use a gill net, there's two things you need to think about: the length of the net and whether it's a floating net or a sinking net. I run a couple different nets depending on the season. We'll get into all those details and my recommendations in a moment. Right here we've got two floating nets. These are replacing some old nets that are beat up. I've got a 50-foot floater and a 100-foot floater. I'll show you the difference here in a second. Let's head over to the patio. So what you're looking at here is a 50-foot gill net. We've got this stretched out on the patio, and it's really important that you keep your gill net nice and tidy. We've got the top line up here. This is the part that floats, and this is really what makes it a floating net. Now there's two parts that float. This line itself has some foam built into it, so it does float on its own, but these little buoys that are spaced out in a 50-foot net, I think I've got 8 of them along the way. These are gonna float right along the top of the water, and depending on the type of weights you put on your net, they're gonna keep your net from sinking down the water column. You want this one to stay up on top of the water column. So there's the top of the water, and it extends about 6 feet down into the water. This line down here is called the lead line. It's actually got lead woven into it. You can feel it, it's a little bit heavier, so that's gonna sink to the bottom on its own, and we're gonna tie weights on there as well. You can see each end of the net that we've got about 10 feet of line hanging out the edges. That's also leaded, and we're gonna tie a little barbell weight on here. Buy these little 2-pound dumbbells. Those work really well for my gill nets. And up top, I put a couple floats on them. I put a little pool noodle and a couple little floats right here. Now, as long as you're not setting this in fast current, which I don't recommend, you wanna put it in slack water, this is gonna be plenty enough to keep your net afloat. In Virginia, you have to mark your buoys with the letter R and the last 4 of your social security number. I haven't done that for the video purposes yet, but I will when I get on the water. Now, the way I like to think about this gill net here is like a big old volleyball net hanging in the water. You're gonna set this up in certain parts of the river based on the season and what you see on your graph. So I chose the spacing in my gill net holes based on what's legal in Virginia. So shad will swim into it, gills will get stuck and they can't back out. These only catch certain size. The little ones can swim right through, and a lot of times the big ones bounce right off. They don't get their heads through there far enough to get their gills caught. So it really focuses on just a certain size of shad that's really good for bait, and it's really abundant in the James River. We're gonna take our sinking line and tie on our weight. I'm gonna use a uni knot so it can cinch down on that weight, and I can remove it at a later date without having to cut the line up. Guess we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. Now we're gonna move up to the top end of the net and take the floating section. I'm gonna put my pool noodle afloat, and then this float is gonna be tied onto the buoy with another uni knot. You don't have to follow this exactly to the T. This is just what works for me. I've been doing it this way for years. I like this because I can tuck my tag in right into the buoy and cinch it down tight. And there's very little that's gonna get caught on anything when I store this. Now, one of the most important things as you store your net is keeping your sinking line separate from your floating line. You don't wanna get this tangled up and twisted. You wanna have it all sorted out. I've got all my sinking line down here bunched up at the end, all my floating lines up here bunched up at the end. I like to start with my 2 very ends, my floating end and my sinking end. So my dumbbell goes in and my floats go in. And with a 50-foot net, you can fit this right into a 5-gallon bucket. I like this because I run this net on my boats and I also run it on my kayak, so I want to take up as little room as possible. As I'm pulling this in, I'm keeping my lines separate. Floating line goes on the right side of the bucket, sinking line goes in the left side of the bucket. And the reason this is so important is when you go to launch the net in the water, you can pretty much just back the boat up and it'll pull out just like this and feed itself right out without getting tangled or twisted. And now with these 50-foot nets, you can throw a lid on the bucket and keep it out of the way. I do recommend drilling some holes in the bottom of your bucket so all the loose water can drain out. Now that I showed you how to set up a gill net and we got this nice 50-foot floating net in this compact little 5-gallon bucket, let's talk about why you might want different nets or which one's right for you. There are really 3 main sizes. There's a 50-foot, a 75-foot, and a 100-foot, but most people either go with 50 or 100-foot. 75 is a nice medium though, so you might want to keep that in mind. I like to use the 50-foot when bait's really easy to catch. The last thing you want to do is put out a 100-foot net and catch 50 gizzard shad because you're never going to use them that fast. You don't want to waste this bait. We want to be good to the resource, good to the river, and only take what we're going to need. Typically when these gizzard shad get caught up in the net, it's pretty damaging to them. It's pretty rare you can get them out of the net and toss them in the water and actually have them swim off. So you really want to make sure that you're not taking more than you need from the river. Enough about that though. In the winter months, I typically go with a longer net. When bait's a little harder to find, it could be a little bit more scattered. However, there are some times when a river's really cold and a lot of fish are congregating in a little hole, and I'll use a shorter net, but we'll get to that in a second. Longer nets generally are good for the winter. Shorter nets like this one are generally good for the summer months. And your spring and fall kind of depend on where you live and what your bait does. So really the biggest part is knowing what your bait does and what you're targeting and what you're trying to catch here. When it comes to sinking and floating nets, a floating net is going to be good when your bait is shallow. So we could be talking a nice warm sunny day when everything's up in the shallows, running the flats, getting warmed up from the mud and the rocks. Might be a good time to use a floating net. Sinking nets are good for when your bait is deep. We're talking 30 feet down or so. Not talking 100 feet. We're talking it's down there in those holes, river channels, along the edges. You want to get that net down and sunk. So really the biggest difference in a sinking and a floating net are those little buoys spaced along the top of our float line right there. With a sinking net, these are not going to be on there, okay? The weights that you tie into the net along with the weighted lead line at the bottom of the net that runs the length of it is going to sink the net down to the bottom. It's going to be laying across the bottom with a bunch of water up top. If you're in a state where a gill net is legal and you want my recommendation for the one net that you might buy, because these are not cheap, they're pretty expensive. You're looking at least $100 usually, 100 to 200 bucks. I recommend about a 50 to 75 foot net, and I recommend a sinking net. The reason being, you can't sink a floating net. If you do, it's going to arch up off the bottom with those floats trying to pull it up while you got your 2 weights on the end. You're going to have to get creative and run extra weights along the length of that bottom line. Where if you just have a sinking net, it'll naturally sink down towards the bottom and sit down there. And you can run it shallow. I've spent most of the summer running a 50-foot sinking net up in the shallows and still doing just fine on bait. The disadvantage there is you can't see the buoys bobbing when you got bait in there. The nice thing about those orange buoys along the way is you can tell when bait's in the net and you can see how much bait you have. If all those buoys are bobbing, you know you got that thing loaded, it's time to pull it out. If you're trying to make a decision based on space in the boat, there's our 50 net packed down with floats on it. Here's a 100-foot net without floats on it. Much bigger difference in how much space they take up in the boat. Might come into your considerations. Let's head to the water and I'll show you how to set this thing. So this right here is the kind of spot you're gonna want to set your gill net in. I see these reeds sticking up here. You can see some mud up along the bank. This is a mud flat right here. I'm only in about 4 feet of water and the front of the boat's probably in about 2 or 3. So there should be shad running up and down this bank. I know that from experience being here, and I also see some little ripples here and there. You can see a couple here, a couple there. So there's definitely fish up in this area. I always like to find my float line first and get that in the water, and I can start unraveling my gill net. Find that sinking line right here. Get those 2 pieces sorted out right away and get both of those in the water. Now you can tell if your net is twisted at all. Helps to have 2 people, but I'm driving the boat by myself, so give me a second. I like to get the boat going in reverse a little bit when I start setting this out. And we can see the net's pulling out really nice. We're gonna get that sinking line, which is in my left hand, to stay towards the bottom. And I'm just gonna pull on this floating line. And if you watch that bucket, since we put it in there so nice, it's gonna come out real nice. And we'll just keep backing the boat up and letting this out. you have two people on the boat, I like to tell them reverse and then neutral. Reverse to get your speed up just a little bit, about half a mile an hour. And then neutral once you reach that speed to just cruise a little bit. I'm by myself, so I have to keep running back and forth to the controls. One thing you can always do is get a lot of your net in the water and just leave your float and your sink line in the boat. Tie them off if you want to, but we're gonna want to get this line pulled really nice and tight and perpendicular to the bank. So I'm just gonna pull that net out till it's nice and tight, get it perpendicular to the bank. I'm also gonna watch my depth here. I'm in about 3 to 4 feet right now. I like to start shallow and work out a little bit. So once we get to about 4 or 5, maybe 6 feet, I'll drop this in, and you can see the net starting to pull perpendicular to the bank. This is looking pretty good. We're hitting 5 feet, starting to drop off, and we'll drop the sink line and the float line. If you're new to gill nets, a floating net can really be a good choice because you can see all those buoys across the top of the water. You can tell when there's bait in there, they'll start to bob a little bit. And this is, oh, just had a bait swim in right there. You can see that buoy bobbing, going under a little bit. We got a couple gizzard shad in there. Here's another advantage of setting your net up perpendicular to the bank. If you're having trouble getting bait, you can run down the bank a little bit and drive it up and force bait into the net. So I'll do that right now for you. So now we're in about 5 feet and the gill net's up there, kind of by that buoy up there. Just gonna drive straight towards it. 4 feet, anything on this flat should be running away from the boat. It might scatter, but hopefully it's swimming right towards our net. And once we get close to the net, we're gonna throw the boat in reverse. Don't run the net over. You'll mess up, you'll get it all ripped up in your prop if you do that. Just throw it in reverse, kind of spook everything in there. And I can see the baits that are in there go nuts a little bit, and we might have caught a couple more. So definitely effective. Another thing you can do is just sit and wait. You do have to stay close to your gill net in Virginia, so I like to spot lock kind of right next to it or anchor next to it, and sometimes I'll fish a little bit. Right now I'll just get my rods ready to go while I wait. When it's time to pull your gill net, one of these little grabber hooks can be really helpful. Right now I'm just going to drive up next to the boat and swoop up the line, and then I'll work my way to the front of the boat, get these baits out. I can see plenty of fish bobbing. You probably can't see it with the darkness setting in and GoPros being the way they be. I like to put my bait in one of these little troughs right here, keep it separate from my ice. About $2 at Walmart. Just like the first time we set our net up, we're gonna put it back very carefully in here so it deploys really nice the next time we go to use it. And we got plenty of bait in here already, I can see it. There's a perfect example right there. He swims right into the net, goes right through one of the holes, can't back himself back out, and he comes out just like that, nice and easy. Can't get better bait than that, my friends. And look at this, we got plenty of bait in here. Look at it all. Boom, boom, boom. We got about 6 or 7 just in the first 15 feet of the net, and this is just a 50-foot net. Perfectly fine this time of year. And just like that, we've been on the river about 10 minutes, got a pile full of fresh bait to go catch some of these big old catfish with. Again, Captain Dan, out here on the James River. If you're ever out here, give us a look. We'll take you out, catch us some fish. If you have any questions, write them down in the comments below. We'll see you on the next one.